It's an honor to be here. I've spoken in this room before for ACES, and one of the things I'm most proud of in ACES is Jim Kravitz, who is the Director of Environmental Programs, was my student in a class 30 years ago. Just thought I'd remind everyone of that. I think Aspen Mountain was either higher or lower at the time. I couldn't remember. Do I need to get in your way? Oh, okay, I have to shed some light on the issue. Yes, so I'm going to speak a little bit. You have very, very stellar scientists in this room: Jonathan Overpeck, Martin Hurling, Jerry Meal, and a lot of younger folks that I'm going to mention in a minute are the ones that, as we move on, thinking through these problems, droughts to floods and back again, learning and adapting as we change over time. What does it mean? Or change is ahead. As I always tell people, you don't need to be the Dalai Lama to know that change is ahead. Right? That's part of the future. You also, as I like to put up, and Mark Swoboda, my colleague, has seen this a lot. There's a headline that most scientists, when they contribute to policy, like to say. Experts say rainfall may lessen drought. Very, very insightful comment, right? Okay, so if it gets wetter, it's not going to be dry. But can we do more than this? But can we also address issues that are complex: droughts, famine, epidemics, and scientists? Or let me look around the room, and hipsters. Anyway, so, I'm being live streamed, yes. Another subtext for this talk is slow onsets, abrupt changes, and fast reflexes. I used to work on issues in hurricanes and ecosystems. I worked on Pacific salmon for a long time. So we're going to think through what this means in the context of the West and other parts of the world. And we'll see how this means. Some of this, Aspen is a place of global travelers, so some of this will be trivial to you, and then the rest of this will be less important. Okay, so as we think through this, let's see how this goes. Okay, hurdles. First thing, how do we learn? Human beings learn in a variety of ways. There's the learning pyramid, right? From here, we teach others up to reading. But educational research has shown that one of the least effective methods is the traditional lecture, which you're about to have. So stop me 2 hours from now. It is common for people who give this lecture to drone on, and I won't disappoint you trying to keep the tradition alive. So let's take a look at something. One of the groups we interact with, this is the World Economic Forum. Okay? For the next 18 months, large-scale involuntary migration, state collapse or crisis, interstate conflicts, and this tells you who's saying it: business people around the world, bankers, politicians, a whole host of people. Unemployment, underemployment, failure of national governance, and there's the percentages who said that. For the next 10 years, water-related crises, failed climate mitigation or adaptation, extreme weather events, food crises, profound social instability, also related to the 4 items above. What is interesting about this is that this has changed from report to report, but this has stayed the same from report to report. This tells us something about the status of those problems as we continue from year to year. Right? So this is actually what we're dealing with, and this is what I'm going to speak to. So let's take a look. I wanted to put this list up because it's an extremely important list to me. John Katzenberger, the person who directs the Aspen Global Change Institute, has created a body of folks and a network of workers who've covered a set of issues that are important to all of us. The first one I was at was in climate extremes in 1998. Then more recently this year, integrating climate change adaptation and risk management. What I'm going to speak about over the next day and a half is what we've learned from all of these. From climate scenarios, weather and climate extremes, science for climate adaptation in mountain and coastal areas, thanks to James, who led a lot of that, frontiers of global change, risk and resilience. These are meetings in which very interdisciplinary people and practitioners who hold the feet to the fire of the people who are doing the research have appeared in, and we've constructed very important collaborations from them. So I want us to keep some of that in mind. I also wanted to mention a couple key people. Roger Barry was a professor of geography, a climatologist at the University of Colorado. Herbert Reel is the Colorado State University, but he basically created the field of tropical meteorology, and another mentor of mine by the name of Gilbert White. There's a statement about living with risk on the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the importance of living with risk, written by this person. He lived in Boulder, Colorado. He's one of the earliest people to, the things we take for granted. Wetlands are important to floods. Having leeways that are not just levees are important. Came out of his work on the Mississippi. And I'm going to come back to why this matters to our talks today. From the physical part, I learned, why do we see these weather features that we do at this time of day along this terrain? Did a lot of work in South America with both of these folks, and when Herb Reel would ask me this question, I said, we're just hiking, and can't you enjoy the day? Of course, I didn't say it that way, Herr Dr. Professor Reel from Berlin. But Gilbert White asked this question, why in spite of so many advances in knowledge and investment are disaster losses increasing? Not simply because of the number of events, but also the social and political issues, and I'm going to speak to that. And then he used to sit me down every month and ask me this question, are you doing anything useful? And he never wanted to know, did you just write an important paper? Are you on a National Academy panel? But are you doing anything useful, and how do you know? And this is the sort of push that gets James, myself, and others into thinking about how we link these two to ask and answer this question. And these are important people in the context of Colorado. They all lived here for a long time. I've lived in Colorado for 30 years. As some people know, I'm from an island in the Caribbean. My great-grandparents are from India, but I'm from Trinidad. And as I like to tell people, I'm from the western side of that island, so I bond with other Westerners. What do we know? 10 indicators of changing conditions. Air temperature, this is not the stock market. Anybody who's looking at some of these graphs. Humidity, temperature over the atmosphere, glaciers, snow, ocean heat content, sea level rise. This is the trends. These are the data. This has nothing to do with projections and making statements about the future. This is in the data and the rates of change. This is also in the data. From the State of the Climate and the National Climate Assessment, Marty Hurling is involved in these. I'm involved in this one. Just to give you a sense of this has real impacts in terms of the trends. There's issues surrounding coral reef bleaching, sea level rise, and something extremely important to all of us in the climate community, the ocean heat content, the things that drive how a lot of climate varies and changes. So if we were to look at, from 1980 to 2017, the US South Central and Southeast regions experienced the highest cost from billion-dollar disasters. These are the billion-dollar disasters over that, basically, 37-year period, telling you where some of these events are and what they've cost us over time. We have a sense of what some of these events cost. And this is actually calculated out of NOAA. I do one of the reviews on it. But this is an important sort of issue. We're not saying that those changes that I pointed to are directly the causes of this. But we want to uncover what the link is between those trends in climate and these types of events. There are 2017 events around the world, a lot of them, right? People would remember, still am doing work on issues surrounding recovery of Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma. And one of these storms went from a tropical depression to a Category 5 storm in a matter of 2 to 3 days, which is a really important issue from the standpoint of recovery. So in the US, we experienced 16 disaster-related events with high costs, $300 billion. But 2017 was historic, the most costly hurricane season and wildfire season, which I'm going to speak to a little bit. Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria now join Katrina and Sandy in the top 5 costly storms. But there's something else why I like to put up this graph, even though it's produced by us. There's a big gap in here on disasters. And the reason is, for a lot of these impacts, you can tell what the insured losses are. Because the storms hit, buildings are damaged. But when it comes to the issue of drought and how that filters into our economies and the environment, we have little sense of how much that actually costs, outside of the insured losses from crops. So this is an interesting difference. It's one of the reasons why we don't see, and one of the central scholars in trying to figure out how to document that is in this room, Mark Swoboda. He leads the National Drought Mitigation Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, and Lincoln, Nebraska is now very famous for having lost the football game last weekend. So, what has happened? There's another risk that's involved with having those sorts of disasters, and this is one I was working on as well. There's the post-Hurricane Maria exodus from Puerto Rico. I also have charts to show the internal migration from the storms that hit Florida, Pennsylvania, Texas. From a small island, we can see migration and impacts from the storms in the Caribbean. This is also happening within the Caribbean region in which I work. I remember once being with the governor of Montana, and I said to Governor Bullock, and he said, well, a great person, he said, I don't care about sea level rise. And I said, so when the sea level rises, where are people going to go? He said, uh-oh. So the connection is not always the linear one that we might think of. So let's think through this. Here's a statement I'd like us to keep in mind from Randy Dole and Mel Shapiro, people who worked in Boulder. Rapid changes may be triggered by relatively fast processes and involve feedbacks among different components. But the tenor of our meeting this week and this talk comes from Alvin Toffler. People might remember this book, which Newt Gingrich wrote the foreword to. The rates of change have implications quite apart from, and sometimes more important than the directions of change. How we make it through a changing environment becomes the important thing, not whether or not what does the year 3000 look like and how do we respond to that, but how we make it through events to events and how we learn over time becomes critical. There's the population growth from 2010 to 2030, and there are the obvious 5 candidates for where the fastest growth rates are. Also, the driest states in our nation. All right, something to keep in mind. There's the decline to 40%, right, from the urban census. But there's something else that is happening. Just as it happens to all of us who are aging, there's the middle that's fattening, right? As we go from 1960, right, to 2060, we see the age differential going from a pyramid. You know, they call it a pillar at the Census Bureau, but it's more like a barrel. The idea is that that happens to all of us over time, and apparently it's happening to the population of the United States, right, as we think through this. This is a figure I like to show. It comes from Bill Travis, who was another one of the people that I worked with. There's the Colorado Front Range, 1960. There's the Colorado Front Range, and if you can read some of this, that's rural, low-density suburban, urban suburban, not build it. Right? And there are the projections for 2040. Gives you a sense of what's happening through the Front Range. I've only lived there for 30 years, so I'm a relative newbie. But then we have lots of folks who are coming in and go, wow, you guys have a lot of room. I go, really? When you have somebody like Jerry Meal, Marla, who's actually from the state, they can give you some context as to how things have changed over time. Well, there's the extensive zone in the Sierra foothills. Something similar is happening. It's not simply that we're spreading out over states, but we're concentrating in pockets that actually make us more vulnerable to particular risks over time. Human beings love to live in dynamic conditions. We love the coast. We love high elevation environments. We love the as in mountains. We love the edge of dry and wet areas like the desert. Well, guess where are the places that are changing the quickest as we begin to look at trends and change over time? Exactly where we concentrate our activities, because we like dynamic environments. That's the nature of where we choose to live. So there's the Colorado Front Range, the realm of the extreme commute, where people drive from here, make sure they have their Suburbans so that they can get over the speed bumps in a Starbucks. It's extremely critical. It's taking longer and longer to get to work in the Front Range. And that's playing havoc in a whole set of other issues surrounding psychology and energy. There's the population density growth projections on the left and a map showing fire hazards, fuel, wind, and long-term dry conditions in California. Again, we like to concentrate where we live among places of high risk, and that is coincident with what our values are. So we're going to come back to some of that. There's a neat map of red is heat, smoke is light blue. Very interesting. This was from 2002. All right? Anybody remember when Governor Owen said, all of Colorado is burning? And the tourism board said, keep quiet. Do not go out there and say all of Colorado is burning. Everyone in this room probably knows we make as much money in the state in summertime recreation and tourism as we do in wintertime. And in fact, it has a bigger impact on small and rural communities because people spread out more, whether it's hunting, fishing, sightseeing, aspen watching, people watching in Aspen, stuff like that. Anyway, so There's the reports. There's the 2012 fire, big issue in Colorado Springs. There's 2002, drought conditions. There's 2018, drought conditions. It was much worse in terms of drought at that time. Right? The difference is the fires this year have been bigger. We had over 4,600 fires at that time in the state. Relatively small ones, except for Colorado Springs, Hayman, and so on. But here we've had very, very large fires. There's the trends that we're seeing. This comes from a recent paper I forgot to put in the reference here. Warm deserts, Arizona, right? Where fires are trending over time. But one of the interesting things here from that paper is here's fuel aridity. There's forest fire area, and the aridity is basically 2000 to 2015. The dryness of the fuel that lights is actually increasing over time. And that's an interesting thing, and we have part of the work we're doing this week, people like Mike Hobbins and others, why is that? When does that happen? And so we want to get our heads around that sort of question before we set fires. About 5.1 million acres were burned in the 2018 period, compared with about 5.9. In 2002, it was about 900,000 in the state. 84% of wildfires are started by people. We know that, right? But what creates the conditions to do it? And as people heard me say in the talk yesterday, as scientists, we look at protons, electrons, and neutrons. We don't factor in morons, people that fire illegal tracers into areas that help create fires. And it's the interaction of our human decisions and those conditions that lead us to think through this situation. This is Eagle Creek. There's a golf course while the fire burns, right? Nobody's fiddling. Columbia River Gorge. The wildfire season has become about 2.5 months longer since 1970. That's not just one study. That's the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise figure. I wanted to show this as well. There's May 2018. Here is the significant wildfire potential outlook. They use a lot of the material that comes out of NOAA and elsewhere. And we had a sense that it was going to be a bad wildfire time, right? So let's think through some of this. Do we know what to do? Well, let's create a fire-resilient landscape. Improve prevention, suppression, reduce hazardous fuels, restore fire-adapted ecosystems, promote community assistance. Most importantly, create a family disaster plan that includes meeting locations, communications, and save the animals. A big part of what happened in Katrina and elsewhere was people stayed with the animals. So we have to create plans that have that as part of them. But what I'm putting up here has been around for 20 or 30 years. So we have a sense of what to do. And the most important addition is go and leave early when you do from Pitkin wildfire. That's a critical thing for getting out of the way, and this is the critical thing for trying to reduce our risk. So I'm going to come back to ask these questions. Why, in spite, the fundamental Gilbert White question, why, in spite of knowing all of these, are we still at risk and the level of risk? So some lessons drawn. A lot of people like to talk about lessons learned. I always ask, who's learning? How did they learn? Well, so they're really just lessons drawn, right? To an extent, we have some lessons that we're drawing, and we haven't learned all of them yet. But there are several that we have that we're going to speak to. One of those is the California drought, a story about this historic drought. And Amanda Sheffield, who's here, did a lot of work on this. There's March 2011, no sign of drought. There's the reservoirs, right? There's California, September 2016. There you go. That's not a political map. That's just how it is. And there's September 2015, what the reservoirs began to look like. In fact, in the intervening time, these all went down to an average of 16% by March of 2015. Pretty dramatic for a state that basically has an economy of about $2 trillion. Very, very important stuff. So, Governor Brown declares a drought state of emergency January 2014, issues an executive order. We had impacts also, from our standpoint, extremely important for NOAA, impacts on ecosystems, on wildlife, and on Chinook. And then came February 2017, and down came the rain. And that was created by what some people have called atmospheric rivers, an entire set of them, right? Coming in through this period, really hitting exactly where they ought to hit. But then something else happened at that time. Oroville Dam. 100,000 CFS. Anybody know what the flow on all of Niagara Falls is? 80,000 CFS. It's 20,000 CFS more basically broke. They had to evacuate 200,000 people from below the dam. So we went through the period of drought. We then had this huge impact, this huge flood, really immense, dangerous thing, breaking away from the spillway onto the sides, rushing out at the level of 1.25 Niagara Falls over a matter of a day or two. Pretty dramatic that is going over this thing. So what should we be prepared for, a drought or a flood? This is not a trivial question for people who have to allocate resources, people in the room who have to plan different activities, There's February 2017. Looks like only the southern part had some drought. The reservoirs began to fill up. The governor lifted the statewide proclamation of emergency due to drought, but kept in place some designated conditions. There's the water year to date. We're back in drought. There's Jan 2011 when it started. There's the major big drought. There's the little wet period done by Orville. And there is what's been happening for a lot of the year. Basically, California precipitation, and this is from Amanda, October, August % of normal. There it is. So we're seeing more and more of this. In fact, in 2011 and 2012, there's a severe flood on the Missouri River, severe drought in 2012, and it was the first time since the Dust Bowl that 3 years of corn yield production had actually declined. This is the first time as a result of those two events. So the combination of these so-called compound risks becomes important for how to plan. When we say, oh, it's drying, okay, good, what do we do about that? Oh, it's getting wetter, what do we do about that? But when we say it's going to go up and down, and anybody that says, well, how can it be wet and dry in this? Every desert is shaped by water. All of us know this in the room. Everywhere we backpack, everywhere we hike in the West, the Colorado River. As I always tell people, the Colorado River and our storage system, which is extremely effective, was not designed to handle drought. It was designed to make use of what we thought was excess water in the system until we moved out there and began to use it. So what we have is what some people call the hydrological cycle, where we go from, oh, there's a drought, I'm so worried. Wow, what are we going to do about it? I'm panicking, we're out of stuff, it rained. Well, who cares about drought? Right? Not uncommon among humans. I don't know if other animals do this. Probably not whales. But as I always tell people, the human mind is so wonderfully complex that you give us a tough technical problem, a complex adaptive system. We're going to solve it. It's the obvious that takes us longer. Right? That's really the hard part of human thinking. So as we begin to think through this, we say, well, can we break this so-called hydrological cycle as we think through adaptation? The problem of water supplies not meeting human demands can be met in two ways. Increase the supply, limit the demand. Both are necessary. Limit the demand for water has been less imaginative, less prone to curb appetites than to invent new ways to satisfy them. Conservation and reclamation are viewed as a last resort. While this philosophy is responsible in part for a multi-billion-dollar project to import water into thirsty areas, it is equally accountable for squandering a lost supply. James Krieger and Harvey Banks, San Diego Water Authority, 1962. Right? Everything that is being suggested and recommended in here is right? We've seen before. So the question is, what allows us to learn lessons over time? So instead of making just, I like to, you make a recommendation of what we ought to do, and we ask, if it's so smart, why haven't we done it? So there are some factors that hold us from making all of these types of decisions. Just to keep us in mind, well, that one didn't come out too clearly. So just where the different water systems are throughout the West. There's Lake Powell annual water budget from Ann Castle. It's in a deficit of about 500,000 acre-feet every year. Right? It says, our methods of determining how much we use are not precise. They have significant margins of errors, and frequently our change in water rights practices don't take that water right uncertainty into account. So we could end up measuring injury in teacups, while the margin of error on the big uses is measured in acre-feet. And El Nino is not a drought contingency plan. In other words, relying on, we're going to get an El Nino event sooner or later. But that's the way it is. So many of the scientists in the room have heard me say this. What's the opposite side of, what do we call the opposite side of El Nino? La Nina. And why do we call it that? Not because of the cold, right? One's cold, one's warm. But when our brilliant scientists who don't like to talk to people about how they think, went to Peru, Ecuador, to uncover what this cold event was. So, okay, if the warm event is El Nino, then the cold event has got to be anti-El Nino. Well, if El Nino happens around Christmas and you're in a Catholic country, you don't want to call anything the anti-El Nino. They learned that. That's a true story, by the way. They learned that pretty quickly. All right, we call it La Nina, all right? Yeah. Notorious RBG was not on the court yet, so they got away with that. Okay, so there's another perspective. Drought hits harder in already dry Indian country. With drought, tribes are the first affected and most affected. They're the ones on the ground who sustain themselves with subsistence hunting, fishing, and gardening. This is a friend of Mark's and mine, Gary Collins. Here's a figure from Marty. There's the temperature and Palmer Drought Severity Index. This period here, about 15 years, from 2011 to 2016, compared to the long term. There's precipitation. There's the maximum temperature, the minimum temperature. There's the Palmer Drought Severity Index. Definitely, the 2000s have been a dry period in the Southwest over time. What does that mean for people that live in that region, in the Four Corners region? As people have heard me say before, when I was working on tribal lands with Mark and others, and I was talking to the Hopi rain priest, and I said to him, how does the rain dance work? And I meant, culturally, significantly, who are you calling? Like the Aztecs call the Chacmol to go speak to the rain god. And he said, you want to know how it works? It's timing. You got to do it just before it rains. And he was the rain priest. Pretty funny folks. They also said when I was there, adaptive management, we've been here for 10,000 years. What are you guys trying to do? So, from a colleague of mine, one of the research entrepreneurs, Margaret Hiza Redsteer, who's Absaroka and Navajo, did a lot of work basically showing that there's sand dune mobility occurring in this area, the marginal areas. Precipitation and potential evapotranspiration, partially active dunes. This is what is happening now in the southwestern United States, in that region. The actual change of vegetation has passed a threshold and a tipping point to make and create fully active dunes over that region. So that's an interesting thing that's happening right south of us over time. It's happening in other parts of the world as well. I sit on something called the Global Land Outlook for the UN Conference to Combat Desertification, and this is happening in many semi-arid regions around the world. So what we've done with a lot of folks in the region, the Dene, Navajo in particular, we've gone back and said, okay, right now you have shrubland. As things change, there'll be mixed grass prairie. As extreme droughts in that region might become more common, so let's think through what the ecosystems might change and look like and where it might move to. And the reason for doing this with people in that region is to document what the elders have learned over time and what we're saying about the changing environment, and to determine where should the dune stability and revegetation actually occur. So it's easy for us to say, oh, why don't you move from there? It's the reservation. That's where people are from. It's where they live now. But there's also an important issue. What they're really replanting are pockets of ceremonial plants that can make it through drought conditions. In fact, when the drought was developing in that region, many of the elders had to go to flower shows to get ceremonial plants. And this is an effort to find pockets that can help at least maintain some cultural stability over time. So let's take another colleague of mine, and these were all parts of those conferences that I mentioned, right? So Margaret Hiza and I worked on that. This is something from Paula Kehoe, a really dynamic person at the San Francisco Public Utility. Yeah. Well, before the drought, we were like, how do we augment existing water supply portfolios, treating the water only as needed for its end application? It turns out that a household wastes about 40% of its water just flowing out of things. A large building wastes 80 to 90%. That just flows out from different, not just from leakage, from just the way water is used in the building. What she did was try to help create an increasing acceptability and adaptability of wastewater infrastructure before the drought occurred. This is what resulted. An opportunity to rethink building design and reimagine how water is used. Up to 95% of the demands, right, in these buildings in San Francisco, it's average 80 to 90 in other places. That's what the top of the San Francisco Transit Authority now looks like because of her work. Every building in San Francisco over 200 or 250,000 feet now has to have a roof like that because of the work that she did. These are the individuals that make a difference in how we think through what we do. The installation on-site water system became a requirement for new buildings of 250,000 square feet. But here's the question. It seems smart, a reasonable thing. Do you think she got any pushback when she started to try to get this done? Both, not just as a woman, but in also trying to advocate a new idea and a new way of planning. This is the danger of making a change and why some changes don't happen, because of the professional risks that many people take in doing this. So she and I wrote a piece that says, look, the way this happened was accept an additional level of risk. She worked with the people to do this. I've just helped her document the ideas. This is really her story. Create a new financial incentive programs and go to the partners to do that. Create a new water management program. Get the health folks to say, we will monitor the quality of the water that is recycling through your building and make sure it's of high enough quality for you so that you could keep using it. And allow the private sector to provide some of its own water supply in those buildings. But most importantly, it was the issue of leadership, hers. Professional risk-taking by her, and her role is usually underestimated in how institutions function. As I like to tell people, no institution, however well designed, water or political, is independent of singular individuals who make the institution meet its goals. And she is one of them. So is Margaret Hiza. So what is the message? In the context of a changing climate, despite advances to date, predicting future hydroclimate variables precisely remain a challenge. Nature is complex. Observing and modeling its nonlinear behavior is very challenging. As what's the popular thing? Was it Niels Bohr who used to say, who said forecasting is very difficult, especially if it's about the future? Long and sustained observation programs are critical, especially for model verification. So factoring resiliency is how we plan for the future. But it takes the risk of individuals like Paula and Margaret Hiza and others to make that change happen. And then institutions come along with them. So what stops us from doing this? Oh, we argue, well, if we only knew the cost. This is Financial Times noted in their words, in the Financial Times. People are afraid that doing something about climate will make them poor or less well off. Well, there's the revenue produced by an acre-foot of alfalfa, $920, lettuce, $6,000, Intel to manufacture 2 chips, make $13 million off of it. Now, the reason why I put this is one of the major things, I'm from an agricultural family, one of the major things is to protect lands in the hands of farmers and agriculturalists. That is something I'm very much interested in doing because they are stewards of the land. What this is the large industrial production that uses water without any guidance on what the return on that investment is. Here's something from Peter Glick, and it's in the National Climate Assessment Report, and he and I actually worked on describing why this actually happened. There's US water withdrawals. There's the US GDP. There's 1975. What is remarkable about this? The total water withdrawal in the United States has leveled off, but it didn't affect the GDP. And yet we're told all the time that to be more efficient, to do all of these things, it's going to hurt you economically. It's going to hurt you in terms of your quality of life. Well, the data from this is from the Corps of Engineers. And the information is pretty clear. But why did it happen? Introduction of efficient technology, behavioral changes, there was no loss. But the most important thing were the 1973 laws, clean water and others, that pushed efficiency. So there's a role for regulation in creating innovation and in helping us to understand that upfront costs are not upfront losses. They're actually investment in a more efficient environment that can get you the benefit right now, as this did. And a lot of people don't know this. We've actually used less water in total across the US. Oh, if only we could assess the risk with greater certainty. Do we really need to have more certainty than that? Strong risk of underestimating the complexity of how we adapt. Here's another bit of this. This report came out in 2017. The first one was written in 2005. I was one of the formal reviewers of this. There's the wildland-urban interface. $1, and this is in federal systems. This is in public and, where we've tried to get a sense of public and private, but this was done by an independent group. I was just one of the internal reviewers. $1 investment on protecting from wildfires saves you $4. On wind, 1 saves you 5. On riverine floods, 1 in 5, and 1 on Corps of Engineers systems, 1 in 7. In the case of hurricane, because it's mostly a water flood issue, it's 1 in $7. An investment of $1 saves you 7. So we know the economic benefit of planning up front. But we're also told that retrofitting gives you about $1.25, in other words, making the house stronger for a hurricane, in return. If you lose $1, you get back $1.25, you save $1.25. But the most important way of planning is land use and design. $1 saves us $4 in the future. I decided not to put a picture of this, but land use planning in Boulder during the 2013 floods, is what actually saved us from the majority of impact. Gilbert White and others created greenways, waterways. In fact, the son of Frederick Law Olmsted created Central Park, kept the farmers' ditches intact, and the waters ran mostly out of the city. That actually is the thing that really reduced the risk. The reason why I didn't put it up there is because then, out of honesty, I would have to put in the fact that the water flowed out of Boulder and then flooded places downstream. Right? But I want us to keep this in mind. Why, in spite of knowing the economic value of things we're doing, aren't we doing it? So if only we could get the communication right. Communication is critical, but it's not enough. The push of the supply of new information by providers and the pull needs to be managed. As people say, I forget who it was, Frances Moore Lappé had a great line. She said, and some of you might know, wrote Diet for a Small Planet. Said, if demand creates supply, who asked for Fruit Loops? It really isn't the case that demand creates, right? We're pushed towards asking for certain things, right? In 1958 or 59, Vance Parker wrote a great book called The Hidden Persuaders, which was exactly about this problem. But the most important part of this is for us to underestimate and think it's only a communication problem when understanding how we learn our lessons as individuals and as societies is underestimated. We have more critical, immediate concerns is another one I hear a lot. And these are all things that we put up to say why we can't act now. A colleague of mine and Mark's, Wadid Arian, he was the person that did the early work showing that in Syria, the drought was beginning to impact how people were. It didn't create the conflict, but how it exacerbated the conflict. Before Tom Friedman and everybody picked up the story. Wadid was the drought planner for the state of Syria. He had to escape after writing this report in the Global Assessment, which I edited, and go to Egypt. He's now the League of Arab Nations water planner. As I like to tell my friends in academia, that's a different risk from revise and resubmit. Right? I know that you guys think that's risky, but this is a different sort of risk. He was the one who first woke us up to the fact that these things happen. But there's something positive that is happening in this. And Andy Hall here is involved in it, Mike Hobbins, several of our colleagues, right? Jim Verdon at the U.S., well, now at the State Department, he was my deputy at NIDIS. How we get ahead of where drought appeals are and when we actually can deliver response. There's a success story. Anybody remember, who's old enough to remember Band-Aid and Live Aid here? All right, good. Okay, Radio Gaga. All right, that was the Queen performance, all right? What was that about? It was about Ethiopia, right? Well, somebody's reading. Anyway, 400 to 600,000 people perished. That led to the creation of the Famine Early Warning System Network. It was the worst drought in 60 years. Sorry, that's the one we had, right? 1984 was the worst. That was when we had Band-Aid, Live Aid, Bob Geldof. It started the whole idea of how do we build in a more fundamental early warning set of information that also has people on the ground engaged in it. Prior to that, most of the work was, okay, we got a forecast. What are you going to do about it? And this effort, there's 2014, 2015, 2016. There's the El Nino event. March, September, there's the rainfall, right, in East Africa, Ethiopia. But what had happened was that the Famine Early Warning System and the international community, the World Food Program, the FAO, the government of Ethiopia, had started creating on-the-ground activities to monitor how households were getting, what the measures of food security were. And the moment things began to start up, they caught on to this. And the issue was that there were activities on the ground. There's the food security projection, and we could talk about what that means, and 20% of the population is malnourished, and you have a famine, things like that. And there is, as updated for June 2016, a major decline. Well, what is interesting about this was this humanitarian response had a different impact as well. And here's the impact it had. The Department of Defense then started telling us that they had heard, and how they hear is a different thing, that Al-Shabaab was ready to come into Ethiopia if it had collapsed under the weight of the drought and the famine. And they were not able to because the country was stable enough. So they didn't rush in to be, hey, we're the heroes, we're bringing food. Staving off a humanitarian crisis was very directly linked to having staved off a conflict crisis in the context of security over time. And that's actually a well-documented thing. Widespread acute food insecurity was avoided in Ethiopia. Early warning, all the work that people are doing here, and the on-the-ground safety nets, the coordinated information services, near real-time application of physical, social, and decision-making to assess food insecurity and to support resource prepositioning in time to stave off the famine. It's a really positive story because it involves the capabilities of people on the ground as well as the international community. And it had two impacts. One of staving off a major, potentially major, food security crisis. This was the drought that was the worst in 60 years, worse than the 84 drought. But it also staved off a potential conflict. That is actually a better documented case than even the Syrian case. But what we're mapping right now are the tipping points, the environment, drought and aridity, the transnational migration, political instability, and how these feed back on each other. This is a project I'm involved in with the Wilson Center. And the whole idea is to keep track of different parts of the world where these things might arise and what are the capabilities on the ground that can be brought to bear both from the scientific community and the humanitarian communities. This is an interesting paper that Will Steffen and others just released. It said, look, there are thresholds that we might be pushed to that might actually alter the tipping points that we're seeing in these places. How likely those are, not sure. Will we be in one area if we undertake stewardship of the earth here, or will we be moving towards a different set of thresholds that we don't fully understand? And those decisions matter are the ones we're making now, right? But as I like to say, it's an uncertain future. And neither should we be using one model to predict the future, because the models all tell us some piece of information that is valuable. As other people have heard me say, remember the 6 blind men and the elephant? So the 6, right? Everybody knows that famous poem, right? Everybody understands a little piece of the problem, but can't understand the whole problem. Well, 6 blind elephants will conclude a human being is flat. They all use the same tools, the same model, the same analysis. So we don't need one or the other. We need to understand how we reconcile and understand what each of the models tell us about the future, not simply finding one path that might be the wrong path over time. So that becomes very important. So if we acknowledge all of these and recognize many of these, why is it so difficult to be proactive? When does foresight matter? We use insurance. I helped set up an insurance group, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility in the Caribbean that deals with hurricane risk and others. Insurance is something we pay into that we hope never to get back, really, right? When does foresight matter? Why is it so difficult to be proactive? And what do we say about being proactive, Mark? Let's be proactive. You first. Right? It's easy to recommend that somebody else be proactive. So we want to think through what that actually means. Foresight over time. Mark likes this one as well. See, this is early warning. And early warning is like taking your car to the mechanic and she says, I can't fix your brakes, so I fixed your horn. We didn't really fix the problem. We're just telling you that there's one. Get out of the way, all right? So there are paradoxes in how we think as humans and in how we plan, regardless of where we are, right? Here are 5 paradoxes in Western water. We want to reduce risks of smaller scale, and we do that. But years ago, Gilbert White and others wrote a piece called The Levee Effect. By reducing the smaller events, we induce development around where if you build a levee, you reduce the smaller floods, people start living next to the levee, and along comes the big flood, right? May increase. But our models fail just when they might be most relied on, which are in rapid transitions, and that's in part what the meeting is about, trying to get a sense of what those rapid transitions are. Markets can allow for flexibility, for adjustment to risk, but are difficult to use to meet all of our other public values, especially environmental values. Planning and action, we all have the plans and look for windows of opportunities, but we're unwilling to accept short-term smaller pain to stave off longer pain. So that's interesting, right? That's a little bit of a paradox, but it's also true. We also say, we need to decentralize, but coordinate better. Right? So we have some paradoxes in the way we think about the different scales in which we want to do things. National versus states, watershed. Wow, I have a critic. Yeah. jurisdictional, and oh yeah, when you're done with getting me all the economic value, get me that environment thing too. Right? This is actually what drives the differences and where we want to come to agree. And as I like to tell people, whenever someone says, oh, well, what do you think about somebody not agreeing with you on climate change? I'm like, well, this is how we adapt and learn. We don't have to agree. There's a famous thing I.F. Stone, the philosopher, used called the Socratic Fallacy. And the Socratic Fallacy is that we have to agree on the mechanics of walking before we take a walk. Well, if that is true, we'll never take a walk together. So the issue is not whether or not we point fingers and how we do this or whether we're alarmist or whatever. It's what makes us take a walk together, right? And that's how we think through it. At the same time, August 2nd, August 20th, is New Orleans safe? Hurricanes, flooding, losing water. California tries to stay atop an economic wave. There's the known and quantifiable threats. These are the things we don't know. Right? So we try to move from planning to implementation, and the people in this room help us do that. Economies, ensuring resilient economies, community livability, promoting environmental resilience, extremes and change, and then put those pieces together. And as I always like to tell folks, yeah, it's great to say this might be an impact. Here's the long-term trends. Here's what's happening in the Colorado. Here's what's happening in hurricanes. Here's what's happening globally. So what? What do we do with knowing that? And how do we do it in an incremental enough way that our partners and people who might not agree with us are behind us? If we only use people who we agree with, sooner or later that's going to get overturned and move back to an older situation that we didn't like. I put this up for somebody. See? The stakeholder process. Sometimes I think the collaborative process will work better without you. It's important to have the right partners in this effort. So what drives disaster risk? The hazard, the exposure, aging infrastructure, and we have a whole lot of that going on, as people know, right? Urbanization and climate change. We try to govern it by assuring some political authority and coherence. We try to develop cultures of partnership. We decentralize those partnerships and support them, legitimize the entrepreneurs, the people that we talked about. And we don't just share data, we share the risks and responsibilities. This is the governance of risk over time, the stages of collaborative problem solving. And they require resources and people. So co-production is in the air. Well, love is in the air, wrong. Nitrogen, oxygen, argon, and carbon dioxide in the air, right? Because when we work with one group and we think we're co-producing, we're leaving many others out. So where does this leave us? The top of the iceberg. Natural resources, ordinary or operational problems, governance and policy, the constitutive and the cultural, trust and relationships. Who decides? We have impacts from population or resources, financial, as well as physical and ecological, and our technology. But the things that really determine how we do and what we act is culture, capacity, communication. Who's at risk and who acts on their behalf? And we tend to focus on these ordinary operational problems. How do we operate the dam? Not, is it the right thing to have? That's the constitutive question. There's a big difference in policy between the ordinary or how we operate our systems to maximize existing goals to the place in which we discuss whether or not those are the right goals. This involves sustainability. And we need to do both. But this one is actually in this area because it takes into account all of the types of things we were just talking about. It takes in context, we synchronize our roles, proactive learning before the failures, and up here we do what we call decompensation. In engineering, there's something called system decompensation. In ecological sciences, they're called buffers. Mapping how we use up the buffers that we actually have, so that when there's a disaster or risk, we actually have access to them. One of the greatest buffers that we've ever had is out of the Dust Bowl, the Conservation Reserve Program was created in agriculture. Put aside 2.5 million acres so that when there's a drought or when there's an impact, we have a place to go for forage and we have a place to go for water. It's one of the longest standing adaptation strategies. Yeah, I don't know one that's longer. I'm just saying that because I don't know if there's any one that's longer. Using up the buffers is where the indicators really matter. The extent to which we're using up our groundwater, we're using up other resources, when in fact some upfront planning, as I just showed, is economically valuable. It's not just saying we need to drop the quality of life in order to act. So what are our fundamental changes in society? Slow or reverse population growth? Everybody asks for that. Change consumption behavior. right? And again, I'm saying this in the context of one of the things we're big on is renewables and the mix of renewables and fossil fuels and others, because the market for solar and wind is actually almost $1 trillion now. I see this as an economic opportunity for getting engaged in. Value changes to support transformations, technological innovations, and the things we're talking about, management, governance. The problem with that is this takes decades, this takes decades, this takes a bunch of actors getting together, which takes time. And we have some people doing this, and this takes decades. As I mentioned before, the rates of change are a little faster than the rates at which we can do this. This is what takes our attention right now, right? The fact that these are the important things, and they take a long time to get into our system. So what we don't want to be is overconfident. One of my favorite slides I put up in almost every talk, so some of you will have seen it. This is going to end in disaster, and you have no one to blame but yourself. The cat has hired her consultants, and she said, okay, Mike Hobbins, scientist guy, tell me what's going on here. So you have a bird. Oh, I've caught birds before. How do you know it's a bird? Let's look at the indicators. It has feathers. Yeah, okay, good. It flew. Oh, yeah, it's a bird, man. I've caught birds. Okay, consultant, I'm going to go catch that bird. The essence of uncertainty is not what you don't know or what we don't know. It's what we have come to believe is true that is no longer true. This is a harder thing to get over. When we've come to decide that the adaptations that we've put into place in the past are also the ones we need for the future. And that's what we want to evaluate. So the cat is saying, yeah, I can take that eagle. And the eagle is saying, what are you thinking? Right? So the most important thing in adaptation is how often and when should we revise our assumptions? The cat has done its analysis, and she says, I've come to believe that you're just a bird, and I've caught birds before. And that's what we're dealing with. The fact that the problem seems familiar, but is actually very different from anything we've done. So when have things gone right? When we've had windows of opportunities. Leadership and public are engaged, and we have a partnership, and we're good at that. One of the places I work in, and Mark knows this, the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint Basin in the southeast U.S., is the most contentious watershed in the United States, on par with maybe the Klamath. Not the Colorado, because over 120 years, we've learned in the Colorado, look, let's not kill each other, and let's try and stay away from the courts and try and work things out a little bit, right? The ACF, they're just learning to deal with scarcity, so they show up armed, right? So if you have a basis and pressure for securing some common good. But bad ideas have windows too, right? Bad things come into place. When everybody says, don't waste a crisis, you're not the only one thinking that, right? There are others who are actually coming in to say, well, let's use up the resources. And I have some good cases of that I don't want to do right now. Collaborative framework between research and management. Example, the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment. There's one in Boulder. Phil Moat, who is here, leads one of them. And at least one or more persons dedicated to championing the issue, the science and policy entrepreneurs. That's like, excuse me, Margaret Hisa, Paula Kehoe, and people in this room that I'm going to embarrass in a few seconds by pointing to them. When was the Summer of Love on Watergate? Who's old like me here? Summer of Love was what year? 60. And when was Watergate? We are closer to the 450, just passed it, and 9 billion people than to either of these. This is closer in our future than any of those things that we're remembering, right? And as I like to say, the climate, it is a-changin'. And I wish I could refuse the Nobel Prize first and then, but anyway, that's a whole other thing. You don't need to be a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. These are people that I owe a great deal, starting with Herb and Gilbert. A whole lot of people that I learned from over time. Don here. And this guy, Steve Schneider. Steve was brilliant. Steve was one of the first people starting the journal called Climate Change that began people to think about how to address these kinds of issues. But this guy really started a fundamental way of thinking of living with risk. So what is needed? Practitioners and researchers who can understand and expand the interface between policy and science are a force pulling us together towards fundamental use, moving seamlessly across disciplines. The methodological innovators would become, without becoming technicians, and our institution builders. Excuse me. James Arnott is one of them. Lorna Cates is one of them. Amanda Sheffield, Mike Hobbins. We have a whole lot of folks in this room who are actually taking on this role. Somebody has to fix the problems we created. Good luck. I want to thank Ed. I only met Ed, I think twice. Right? Created High Country News, Peonia. He passed away just recently, right, in the last week. So I'm sure glad the hole isn't in our end. Thank you.